Summer, 1958. The Eisenhower administration announces it's going to stop atmospheric nuclear tests. This doesn't sit well with Heinlein. It doesn't sit well with him at all. In the middle of writing another book, Heinlein tosses his work aside and begins to furiously pen a response to what he considered the travesty of reducing the United States' nuclear capability. A vocal militarist all his life, Heinlein, who would support the Vietnam War and served on a council that advised President Reagan regarding the Strategic Defense Initiative, decides he has to make his views known. In a bare few weeks of writing, he's finished it. His response to all of the weakness and coddling he sees growing in America. He sends it off to his publisher, the publisher he's written so many young adult novels for, and they reject it as too extreme. Angered, he decides he's done with juveniles. He begins to rewrite, but now he's writing for adults. Never again will he water down what he has to say. Now begins the great age of Heinlein. Heinlein Unleashed. Of course, this book was Starship Troopers, one of the most debated books in science fiction history. Heinlein haters accuse it of being overtly fascist in nature. Heinlein apologists try to reconcile it with some of his other libertarian work while ignoring the fact that it champions a world government that doesn't allow for political self-determination unless a person goes through years of absolute servitude to the state. While Starship Troopers was the book that popularized Space Marines and power armor, it's a lot more than that. For all the action in it, the most important bits actually happen in the classroom or in discussions. The novel pushes the concept that only the strong will survive, and that resolution through force is often the best course of action. In hindsight, this ends up being somewhat ironic, as the thinly veiled conflict Heinlein was talking about with the book was the Cold War, which ended up being resolved peacefully. But such was Heinlein's view. Perhaps the most telling sentences in the book are, "All correct moral rules derive from the instinct to survive. Any breed which stops its own increase gets crowded out by breeds which expand." But beyond just violent survival and the necessary dominance of one group over another, the book also makes Heinlein's view on the state of American society equally clear. He sees it in moral decline, but not the moral decline so often decried, where the complaints are about clothes being too revealing, music being too explicit, or church attendance becoming lax. No, Heinlein's moral decline was about the decline in discipline and a willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. Throughout the novel, the main character is repeatedly lectured on the value of discipline, and young characters being beaten or executed for undisciplined behavior is portrayed as a good thing, even the correct way to raise children. The fall of Western democracy in the book occurs during a period called the Disorders, and is attributed to undisciplined voters not deserving a vote. The book argues that the most stable form of government is one by military rule, governed by veterans. Because Heinlein reasons, by nature of their service, they understand sacrificing for a greater good, and that, not intelligence, moral virtue, or governing experience, is the most important thing to voting well and governing well. Now, the idea that military service engenders this has been proven untrue time and again in the military dictatorships of the 20th and 21st century. But Heinlein was perhaps counting on veterans as a whole to act differently than military leaders as individuals. Heinlein follows Starship Troopers up with an adult version of the book he'd put aside, Stranger in a Strange Land. Amusingly, for a book once tentatively titled The Heretic, it draws its title from a line in Exodus, because like Moses, the main character is forced to wander from his homeland. It's a book about a human raised by Martians who comes back to Earth to see human society from a perspective distinctly outside it. It questions the social mores of an America which serves as a stand-in for some of the extreme elements of America that Heinlein saw at the time. Stranger in a Strange Land is Heinlein's first aggressively libertarian book, with its oft-repeated catchphrase, "Thou art God." It questions institutional religion and governmental structures. But it also captivated the burgeoning hippie movement with its gospel of free love. It was one of the most sexually explicit books in science fiction at the time. It argues for unrestricted sexual freedom and the uncoupling of sexual practices from moral restrictions. Unfortunately, at times this comes off a bit like a juvenile fantasy, where women are simply sexually available all the time. The book's interest in sexual freedom also seems to draw a line at male homosexuality, as the few references to it are largely couched in a negative light. But despite all of this, its salacious nature and its ability to bring in people championing personal liberty, or at least their own personal liberty, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum, made it the first sci-fi novel to make it on the New York Times bestseller list. His next truly standout novel is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It rounds out Heinlein's philosophy and is perhaps one of his greatest works. It turns his libertarian musings into a cohesive vision of a polygamous, laissez-faire society bound by personal reputation rather than laws. It's a tale about a lunar colony revolting from Earth and declaring its freedom with the help of a sentient AI. Much of the book is dedicated to describing the freedoms that Heinlein felt frontier societies bring, with its lack of rules, people being judged by their standing in the community, and where necessity breaks down sexual mores and traditional taboos. In the book, he often talks about his libertarian economic ideas. In fact, the book is actually what popularized the acronym TANSTAFL, or There Ain't No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, emphasizing how everyone should be responsible for their own economic well-being and how anything free comes at someone else's cost, so a person shouldn't expect anything for free. Which is a little ironic, because basically the whole book centers around a computer that Earth installed at great expense, which the lunar colonists co-opt without paying for, and without which their revolution would have no chance of succeeding. After this, though, Heinlein's health takes a turn for the worse. Starting in 1970, he begins dealing with a series of serious afflictions, and his writing is never the same. He starts pushing the sexual taboo side of his work more and more. Incest starts to dominate his writing, and justifying or glorifying it seems to be more of a focus than the political or economic ideas of his earlier work. So Heinlein leaves us with a mixed legacy. He was one of the first writers to break science fiction out of being niche and bring it into the mainstream. He brought big ideas to science fiction and, agree with it or not, contributed to the philosophical underpinnings of modern libertarianism. His books are still the only science fiction works on the US military's official reading list, and have become part of recommended reading for most of the military academies in the United States. He is the grandfather of military sci-fi and libertarian science fiction. But his grand ideas of total liberty are often marred by contradiction. He suggests that the world should be free of racial prejudice while writing books like Farnham's Freehold, which is filled with horribly regressive notions about race, as well as outright racism and sexism. He talks about a society where there is equality between the genders, but many of his female characters serve as little more than sex objects for the men, rarely getting the development or the agency of any of the male characters. He sees himself as offering a world where everyone pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and people only get what they earn. But his most famous characters can only exist and enjoy total freedom because of the privileges they didn't earn. For example, Mike Smith of Stranger in a Strange Land is inordinately wealthy due to an accident of birth, and Lazarus Long won the genetic lottery, being one of the first people born immortal. And these inconsistencies actually play a huge role in the history of sci-fi, because they are, very specifically, what later authors like William Gibson would fight against. By putting in women as engineers and making mixed-race characters, Heinlein seems to think he was doing his part to create that free society he often talks about, oblivious to the ways in which he's actually only talking about a society that's totally free for men like him. That's not to say he wasn't trying. Just that he saw himself as the self-reliant, competent man that he so often wrote about, which meant he never had to question himself or try to examine his worldview from the outside. And it is this idea of closely examining our conceptions of the world, that later authors will pick up on and will cause a sea of change in sci-fi. So join us in a few weeks for the member of the Big Three that starts to open the lid on that self-reflection. Arthur C. Clarke. Will Arthur C. Clarke you then? Huh? No? Is that bad? Was that? Guys? Anyone? Come on.